Hello, everyone. My name is Nahed Mansour, and I'm the Senior Manager of Programs at the Gardiner Museum. Welcome to our 3 Works program. Today, the Gardiner Museum's Chief Curator, Sequoia Miller, will be in conversation with Brendan Tang. They will be discussing 3 of Brendan's work that speak to the notion of nostalgia. The conversation between Sequoia and Brendan will be around 30 minutes, and a Q&A will follow. We invite you to send us questions through the Q&A function at any point. You will notice your mics and videos are muted and the chat option has been disabled. Also, please note that this program is being recorded and live streamed through Facebook Live. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that Toronto is located on the treaty lands and ancestral territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Petun, and the Mississaugas of the Credit Nation. The community we work in is the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to learn and live on this land. I'll now mute my mic and video and hand it over to Sequoia.
Great, thank you, Nahed. Hello, welcome to everyone who's joining us today. It's great to be here again for another 3 Works session. And Brendan Tang, hello, welcome to the Gardiner.
Hello, the trip to the Gardiner has been the easiest this time around.
Right, very good. So I'll start off by introducing Brendan. For everyone here, Brendan Lee Sadish Tang is a visual artist internationally recognized for his sculptural ceramics. Tang's work explores issues of identity and the hybridization of culture, while simultaneously exploring both futuristic technologies and ancient traditions. Although he's primarily known for his ceramic work, Brendan continues to produce and exhibit in a wide variety of media and mixed approaches. Tang's professional practice has taken him across North America and to India, Scandinavia, Europe, the Middle East, China, and Japan. Brendan currently lives and works on the unceded territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations, also known in settler lingo as Vancouver, BC. So again, Brendan, welcome and thanks for joining us today here.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe I'll start off before we start looking at some images, just asking you how you're doing and how things have been going for you during this unusual time.
Yeah, it's been good. I oscillate, well, it's, when the term physical distancing or social distancing started up as an artist, a full-time artist, I was just like, that's pretty much my life. As that I didn't know what the name of it was, but now I know what an artist's life is like. Yeah, I'm just usually in the studio kind of toiling away kind of by myself. So it's been normal in that regard. But then, as soon as I leave the studio, the panic attack and putting the mask on and the reality hits me pretty hard. But yeah. Beyond that, I've been in the studio, which has been an incredible luxury to have.
Well, a number of artists have spoken to how this has been this kind of funny time for them because it is a sort of crisis on the outside in many ways, but inside the studio space, it sort of reiterated a lot of the reasons that a lot of makers have chosen studio practice and a studio life, and sort of both opened up a kind of time, given there are often fewer commitments externally, and been able to kind of so this question of concentration, I think, is really different. Like what enables focus and concentration is, I think a lot of us are finding some avenues for greater focus and some avenues where we're completely distracted.
Yeah, I think early on when the news was really full, and not that it isn't now, but I think my concentration levels were really kind of quite low. I'd be able to work for a bit and then be scrolling, looking for the bottom of my Facebook feed, kind of taking it all in. But I don't know if I've gotten used to it, but yeah, creating barriers.
It's funny. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can start looking at some works again, but hang on a second. Okie doke, so there's our title slide. Sorry, there's always this little kind of tech business. I know what I need to do. Okay, so hopefully now you, Brendan, and everyone else can see one of your artworks. It's a manga or malu piece. And this one's version 5.0-W. I do want to ask you about the sort of series part of the title, but maybe you could start off by describing what we're looking at.
So what we're looking at is, this is a series that I've been working on for, I think like almost 15 years, probably more, which is quite a luxury to kind of be working at something for this long and still have a lot of interest in it. So the original idea behind the Mango Ormolu series is kind of flipping through ceramic history books and coming across an image of ormolu, which is 18th century European practice of importing Chinese porcelains. And they did this to a lot of things like furniture and jewelry and whatnot. But in my case, they were importing ceramic vessels, and then they were putting all this gold filigree all around the object as a type of ornament. And it was also a way to make it more relevant to the culture that they were selling these objects to, these curiosity objects. And so I was really interested about those ideas of hybridization and cultural appropriation. And so I went ahead and I did a similar gesture where I conceptually removed that gold filigree and Rococo kind of ideas or aesthetics and replaced it with things that I'm interested in, which is science fiction design and giant robots from outer space kind of thing. So originally the series, the robot elements looked more like armor on top of these objects, but as the work has progressed, it's evolved, and that is also in the titling a little bit, but it's involved. And the series that we're looking at right now, it looks like the robotic element is coming from inside the ceramic vessel and emerging or being birthed from the ceramic vessel. And yeah, and that's kind of one of the more recent iterations in the series, or jumps in the series.
Yeah, you know, I'm glad you brought that up, because actually that's how it had struck me. This work and some of the more recent ones relative to the earlier ones, where it did feel very much like the manga part was almost like the pieces were being overtaken, or kind of not attacked exactly, but that it was some sort of force or entity that was coming at the work. And especially this piece, the way that the front of it is kind of looks like it's wrinkled up, which we'll talk about in a sec, but this one absolutely does have the feel of it kind of emerging from within, I suppose. And I'm wondering what that suggests to you, or how that feels to you around some of these questions of identity, which are embedded into this work. And both, I guess embedded implies adding on to, but also emerging out of this work in a very direct way, because you've spoken in other contexts about your sort of negotiation, in a sense, between the present and the past, or kind of the future and the past, in a sense. So I'm wondering about how, I guess, if you're surprised in some way that the manga part is emerging out of, and what that suggests for you in the context of identity.
Yeah, I think with the earlier ones, yeah, the earlier ones, there were that sort of armor or cyborg-like relationship with the forms, and then as the work progressed, it then turned into another iteration where the armor or the additions started to interact with the ceramic form, and it started pinching and pulling and squeezing, like the ceramic blue and white reference, the historical reference, almost had like that, you know, that term muffin top, where, you know, like where you wear a belt that's really tight. And anyhow, these are middle-age problems.
Is it? Yeah, I was just gonna say, this isn't aging.
Yeah, and so these are like thinking about those kinds of things and that sort of adversarial relationship, as you're sort of talking about or alluding to. And then I wanted to sort of flip the script and kind of toy with this idea of like, with ceramic vessel, there is the exterior of the form, and the other binary of that is the interior of the form. And I was curious about how that narrative would change if it looked like the robotic element was coming from within. So I started playing with that, and I feel like it changed it in the sense that it now becomes less about one thing against another, but now one thing transitioning to another, which is an interesting kind of narrative. And then it made me start thinking about how things like Facebook and social media and TikTok and all of that sort of stuff does come from our hardwired desire to be social, to connect with one another, to gossip, to do all this sort of stuff. And And I feel those social media platforms have just amplified and magnified and into, in some cases, a really kind of odd and peculiar way, but it's just amplifying what we have innately in us. And I feel like those robotic elements maybe it is coming out of our own history, our own material history and our own cultural history.
Wow, I love the idea of hybridity as being an indication of transition, maybe more than an intersection in a way, is something that I think you're pointing to by the kind of emergence of the robotic part. I think also I'm really glad that you brought in the kind of inside-outside aspect, because there is one whole sort of tradition of thinking about the vessel as being the interior of the form, right? That the vessel is the space enclosed by the ceramic wall rather than the ceramic wall itself. And so in a way, you're kind of filling it, like you're making your origin point, I guess, in a sense, is different. Your origin point in works like this one, the one that we're looking at, is the robotic piece rather than the origin point being the historical piece. I love also how in this one, as in some others, you're playing in a different way with the trompe-l'oeil aspect, or the kind of fooling the eye aspect. And here you're doing it with the kind of wet, dry, sort of soft, hard. Can you speak to how how the clay looks like it's being pulled up and kind of rippled in a sense?
Yeah, and I think I was thinking with that sort of fleshy kind of metamorphosis or representation of the ceramic form, it kind of breaks our understanding of ceramics and the reality of ceramics about, if you were to try and do that with an actual ceramic piece, it would just crack and shatter
right.
a whole bunch of pieces. And so I really kind of enjoy that idea of it becoming like this really fleshy, malleable kind of vulnerable object in a different way. And I think definitely stemmed out of ideas about the ceramic object being a stand-in for identity and culture, and thinking about how those things are really quite malleable, and even like more so than it is ever, like especially now that we all have like online identities and versus our in-person identities versus our domestic or familial identities. And so I'm kind of playing with that kind of thing. And I wanted the ceramic object to kind of feel like it could be stretched and pulled and in a similar sort of way. I think there is that kind of concept, but I think at the end of the day, I like kind of, this is going to sound really dark, but I like placing little traps out for the viewer. And some people will come to the objects as maybe an appreciation of blue and white painting, or maybe throwing or building in ceramics. And others will be like, whoa, what's going on with that? Or the trompe-l'oeil aspect. And so it becomes yet another sort of lure to hook a viewer in, to kind of have them sort of sit with the piece a little bit longer and ask more questions as to why I did that.
So why blue and white? What about the sort of Chinese blue and white and the vessel part of it? What about that is resonant for you?
Yeah, I think the blue and white is definitely like kind of thinking about the idea of the topic of this talk, like the ideas of nostalgia. It really, I feel, triggers a lot of people in terms of an instant sort of recognizable object. And as an artist, it's great when you can sort of kind of Trojan horse an idea in something. Here is something that's really familiar to them. For most people, blue and white is very familiar, and it's a decorative style that has sort of spanned the globe, originally starting in the Middle East and then moving to China and then Japan and Korea and all of that sort of stuff, and then out to the European countries, and it kind of gaining its own aesthetic in the Netherlands and in England and all of that sort of stuff. So I find that kind of really interesting, this decorative telephone game that's been going on with the pattern itself. And I feel like it was something that that I could jump into and be able to use without it having like a heavy amount of baggage to it. Do you know what I mean?
Right. Well, it has a lot of baggage, but it's not heavy baggage in a sense.
It's not heavy, but it's like, it's just so distant, it's like, when I'm teaching and there's a student that's really loves making skulls, And I'm like, well, skulls are really interesting, but they have their own, weight to it. And they could be like, well, I want to do the skull piece, and it's about, this relationship I had with my dog, and they loved bones. And you're like, well, that's good, but the skull is such a heavy icon.
Right.
That has a lot of baggage. And so the blue and white, I feel like it does have a lot of baggage, but I'm able to sort of hook into it, and people are like, I'm familiar with that enough.
Cool. Well, I think one aspect of blue and white being so familiar to so many people and having all these iterations, as you described, both Asian and Middle Eastern and European and American certainly. I think that's also a way of getting to questions of globalization, I guess, and sort of kind of global flows of ideas and technology. And I'm curious how the specificity of blue and white and the near universality of blue and white sort of weighs against the specificity of the identity part of it. Like, to what extent is blue and white in the context of these pieces Chinese, say, or to what extent does it how much is it also pointing toward all these other manifestations that you've mentioned?
Yeah, I think for the most part, I've always cited Chinese works in the various dynasties, from the Ming dynasty to the Yuan dynasty to the Qing dynasty as well. And there's been some manipulation in sort of the image that I'm sort of collaging onto the vase forms, or the vessel forms. And what's really funny is that they're in other communities. Like, I remember sort of showing this work in the Netherlands, and they would just immediately just sort of see it as just Dutch. They wouldn't sort of look at the iconography and just be like, oh, that is, that's a Chinese lion, or that is a whatever pattern. But they would just, it was almost like, like they see it, but they're looking at it, but they're not seeing it. Does that make sense?
Oh, you bet it does. Yes,
yeah.
Sure.
It's like, I'm kind of hearing you, but I'm not listening to you. It's kind of like that sort of thing. They just sort of see the icon. And because it is such a rich part of Dutch culture, they just sort of see it as what it is. And so that I find really interesting. And also, like, the technological parts, like I am kind of citing Japanese at the beginning, Japanese manga and anime, and sort of the rise of the Transformers coming out of Japan and stuff. But I feel like that is, like, manga is such a pervasive kind of aesthetic. It's like everywhere. They're doing it to like Batman, which is as American as apple pie, as they say, is now done, sometimes is rendered in a very anime sort of style, which is kind of interesting. Which is also, kind of going back, looking at anime's history within Japan, aping animation maybe coming out of France or coming out of America, sort of post-war, is kind of also an interesting history as well.
Well, I think you're pointing to this question of appropriation, which you speak to in your work, and I'm wondering, I guess, when I don't know what the question is exactly, but like how appropriation is both specific and generalized, and like and who appropriates and when and in what context is so much a part of how its meanings get kind of wrapped up. And in a way, you have all of these multi-layered identities, and you're using a tradition, let's say, that's Japanese anime, and you're pulling it into a context that's kind of resonant for you. On the other hand, anime is also, it has this sort of pervasion. As you say, it's kind of like a global style in some ways, and it's sort of ready to be appropriated in a sense, or kind of oriented toward appropriation in a way like blue and white is and was at the time too. So I guess I'm wondering, maybe we should switch to the next image for this, just for the sake of variety. I'm wondering, I love this. This has more of that kind of fleshiness, even like more emphatic. It's so great. So I'm wondering about appropriation and in this work, how, do you feel like you need to be careful about appropriation in any context, or do you feel like it's an open field for you?
I don't, well, to answer sort of the the last question first, I don't think it's an open field. And it is a question that I am constantly asking. And so it's been 15 years that I'm asking this question. And it's a really interesting one, because I think in a lot of ways, like I feel like this work is almost like a very strange self-portraiture, if you will, or an exploration of my own identity and unpacking my own kind of ideas about myself. So I was, like, my parents immigrated from the Caribbean to Ireland, and I was born there, and then we immigrated to Canada. And so for the most part, I've been raised in a very sort of in a Western sort of space. And it's been unusual to kind of sort of reconcile my ethnic history. Like, my father's ancestors are from China and my mom's ancestors are from India, and reconciling those kinds of ideas about my ethnic identity and then sort of the culture in which I've grown up in. And so what's interesting is that I feel like the Ormolu at its very core is almost like, it was like looking into a mirror. You know what I mean? Here I was, this sort of Chinese vase, or Asian or Oriental vase, to use a very problematic term, but with all this sort of Western filigree on top of, or kind of ideas. And so I feel like the Mango Ormolu series is kind of exploring those ideas of just like, where do I go, and can I use these images because of my history and because of my people's history? And those are some really interesting things to sort of think about and to explore. And it's a very funny thing to be exploring my identity through a very Western lens, essentially. And so I like that dance and that sort of confusion and ambiguity that kind of can exist in those spaces. But yeah, like, I think cultural appropriation is a really big thing for me to be thinking about, and thinking, especially now, you know, like, I think as a culture during these times, like, one of the major things that have been coming up is, of course, the systemic racism within our culture, and how we reconcile that and make it better so that there's more people at the table, there's more voices being heard. And yeah, it's an interesting time to be thinking about that as well.
For sure, yeah. I'm curious how your thoughts about, I mean, Canada's sort of presents itself so much as a multicultural society, right? That's sort of, I don't know if it's the foundational myth of Canada, but it's absolutely the proposal, I would say, of Canada for the last, 30, 40 years. I'm wondering how your thoughts about both within yourself and within yourself as a Canadian, or the part of you that feels Canadian, how you're thinking about multiculturalism now as a promise, as a reality, as a fantasy.
I would fall into the camp of saying that it is kind of a fantasy and a promise that we kind of strive for. I think we have a lot of work that needs to be done, looking at our institutions, looking at our educational institutions and the sort of discrepancies that are there. And I think, I do hope that we are kind of making moves towards more diverse representation within our communities, and I think it's slowly happening. I just hope it sort of sustains in a lot of ways. And I think there is that sort of, I'm sort of tamping my cynic right now, but yeah, I'm I would love to sort of see, especially with the current movements within the Black Lives Matter that's happening now and continues to happen, that continues to reverberate and actual change is happening. But we'll see. I think a lot of us in the BIPOC community, well, no, I can't say that. I will only speak for myself, and to say that I'm still sitting back, just watching and observing to see where this goes, because I think you can ask anybody, and you can ask women this, it's like they watch the sort of the rise and fall of these sort of ideas, and I think people in other marginalized communities probably feel the same way, where you're just like, okay, I'm hearing the words, but now let's see the actions.
Right. I mean, in another way, in another sense, you're speaking to the muffin top thing again of like being a little bit older and like not having your first sort of exposure to a kind of optimism or to a set of possibility and potential, but seeing it sort of rise and fall in different ways. I guess I'm thinking about blue and white also still within this context of multiculturalism and possibility, and thinking about how it has these sort of multiple identities as being Chinese and as being universal too, and how you're turning it into a body in a way as well. And one of the aspects of these works that is, it's a little bit nerdy on the clay end, so I hope that folks will be a little bit tolerant of this, but it's the pieces that you're referencing are porcelain. And so they're, it's a very kind of hard, dense clay, usually rings, has a very kind of white surface, and it's ornamented with blue. And you're making these works, I'm pretty sure, out of a medium range or a low firing clay. So you're using a white earthenware, I believe, to reference porcelain. So in a way, you're creating these, and I sort of trompe l'oeil also, this, like, it both is what it is, but it's not what it looks like at the same time. So you're working at a material level around this question of assumptions and identity and image, basically. And so I'm curious about how both the actual like your material choices and the fabrication of the work, and how that plays into this set of questions around hybridity, intersectionality, and multiculturalism.
Oh boy. So yeah, like I think at the beginning, my material choice was mostly out of a technical choice. It was like, because the things that I'm doing to the clay body, if I were to do that in a porcelain, because what I do is I throw a lot of the elements, I hand build and I slab build, and I use extruders and stuff like that and I make all these little elements, and then I construct or create a composition from objects that may have come from a potter's wheel, may have come from, rolling something out with a rolling pin or whatever, and then sort of assembling them. And so because of that, there's material limitations I can do with porcelain. Like if I was to make it in porcelain and take it up to the maturing temperature of porcelain, it might tear itself apart because of the particles and all that sort of stuff that I kind of don't understand, but I still work in material. But as I also kind of really liked by using this low fire white earthenware, there is something that's interesting there for sort of the deep ceramic nerds in terms of thinking about the hierarchy of this material. Of course, porcelain is, the top build ceramic object or ceramic material, and then it kind of goes down to like stoneware, and then like way down here is like the earthenware land. So there's something that's interesting about that and how that enters into the conversation, the material of it, and then the conversation about hybridity and trompe l'oeil. And yeah, I think there's something that it kind of enters into the conversation. I don't know if it really, again, I've had this work, people will look at it and they'll be like, I love your porcelain works. And I'm be like, I don't correct them. I'm just like, thank you.
Right.
That's really great.
Sure.
So it's, I think that's kind of also an interesting part of it, but I think there is such a small percentage of us that kind of know about those differences. But that being said, it's like, showing this work in a community that is incredibly familiar with porcelain. I've had some occasion to show some of this work in China. And I would say that there's more people that are more familiar with porcelain. And so when they see this work, they do sort of see it as another, in a way,
right.
as very much like how one would look at a hybrid as a hybrid, and not either I don't know why I thought of like horse and donkey. What's the hybrid? Is it a mule? I can't remember, but it's
something like that. And
something like that.
Yeah.
But it was like horse aficionados would be just like, no, that's a mule. That's not a horse.
And you're speaking to visual literacy in a sense too. And so you're also playing with this, like who's literate and what, and does it matter, and how much does it matter? Like I'm relatively literate in ceramics, but pretty illiterate when it comes to manga and anime. So like, I don't know, like if I looked, I mean, I would look at this piece and think like, oh yeah, that's a Chinese Mei Ping, maybe like generally Ming Qing dynasty, right? But the manga part of it, I'd be like, oh yeah, it's sort of some vaguely robotic kind of entity.
Yeah.
And there's a certain kind of humor that you're dealing with there too, and where you are expecting literacy and where that literacy is valued, I guess.
Yeah, and I think there's like, I'm using some very broad aesthetics, like the blue and white aesthetic and the manga aesthetic. It's like we all have some sort of cultural familiarity, like different sort of ratios of it. But I feel like they're almost so universal, especially now that every summer, except for this summer, a new Marvel movie kind of comes out and everybody just flocks to the theaters and watches big explosions of alien ships and all of that
Right.
sort of interesting stuff. We all have that sort of cultural familiarity with that aesthetic. And then we're kind of culturally familiar with the blue and white, either from blue willow plates that our grandmas had in the kitchen or whatever, or going to the Gardiner Museum and seeing actual blue and white paint pieces. So it's like, I think those are some interesting things that I'm kind of sort of pulling into it. And, in a lot of ways these objects become almost like, like a painting, where painting is creating illusionary space. I'm kind of creating that illusionary kind of thing where I'm referencing these objects, but not being these objects.
Right. Yeah, for sure. But it also kind of is the object at the same time too. So it doesn't quite end. It's on a beam, you could say. It just kind of keeps.
Can we bring in a semiotics person in? Like, zoom in
right.
somebody that.
No, I decided to leave it. So I guess actually, I mean, in a way, you sort of brought this up, but I was thinking in terms of semiotics, I was thinking about the idea of the paragon or of the frame or of the supplemental, and how ormolu is on. When it gets interpreted, it's sort of interpreted as a frame. So it did a couple of things in the historical context, in the European context, in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries by kind of framing these at first very valuable, very exotic, you could say, objects from China that arrived in Europe by, it sort of declared and enhanced their value by encapsulating them in this sort of gold frame. It also, for many of the ormolu objects, it changed the typology of the object. So it turned a base form, like this one is based on, into a pouring form, or into a more typical European shape by adding, spouts and handles and other elements. And so there's, on the theoretical level, there's this idea of adding a frame to a piece to both declare the presence of the artwork, right? That the frame is the boundary between the artwork and the world. And it's the sort of declaration of its specialness. And with ceramics, that always gets trouble because ceramics always have this kind of funny, it's like the double-edged sword of ceramics in a sense that it both is very much a part of the world, but also objects such as this exist, separate from the world. The reason that I feel like you kind of spoke to this without me asking about it has to do with the notion of coming out of. So for me, the idea that the manga comes out of the work, which is a little more evident in the first piece that we were talking about, that I think sort of destabilizes the idea of ormolu in a sense. It sort of undoes the notion of a frame, or it makes us think about when our frames are internal, like what does that do to us? How does that, like what happens when the frames, it's almost like Alien, like when the frame bursts out from us and then redefines us externally. Sort of strange. I do want to ask you, I want to come back to the idea of nostalgia and think about nostalgia and looking backward in this moment of critique and reconciliation and really reevaluation of values. And often nostalgia is understood to have a kind of gauzy or sentimental sort of mode where you look back at like the good old days kind of thing. And, there's a pretty thoroughgoing critique around ways of thinking about both our recent past as a culture, as the West, or with, a broader past. So and you've been thinking about the past through your work in these ways for some time. And I'm wondering how your thoughts about nostalgia get reconciled with this kind of critique that is happening.
Yeah, I think there is I think there is possibly like the idea of the deconstructing of the notions of nostalgia and what our expectations of these objects are. In a lot of ways like this, I'm, you know, deconstructing the way we interpret or understand the physical properties of a porcelain Ming or Qing dynasty vase, and by wrinkling it up like flesh. And so there is kind of a loose dismantling of these ideas. And it, you know, I do feel like there is something that's quite nostalgic about obviously these objects kind of referencing blue and white. And then in some regards, like they become like toy objects, like they're referencing sort of old toys that I might have played with. Okay, I still play with like the Transformers and the Gundam and all that sort of stuff. So, but like I think there, with how the wrinkling of skin is, I'm kind of dismantling those sort of questions around nostalgia. And I do feel like nostalgia does get us into a lot of problems. And I think we can kind of blindly kind of go in to continue the systems and the ways that we work without sort of questioning our assumptions that are maybe rooted in sort of these nostalgic ideas of what our culture is, what Canada is, and what Canada's history is, and if we are this sort of melting pot or you know, sort of mix of communities and diversity, or is that really true? Is it really true that Canadians are super polite and whatever? So like, it's like those kind of questionings that it is part of this work, is part of that conversation as well, to some degree.
Sure. Well, I feel like nostalgia also plays a pretty strong role in the third work that you brought today to share, which is this piece, Atari ET. So I'd like to ask you maybe just to describe it a little bit first to start. Before you do, though, I wanted to flag that we are going to be taking questions in a couple minutes. So folks who are listening, if you have some questions you'd like me to pass Brendan's way, now's a good time to use the Q&A function of Zoom to ask some things. So Brendan, though, maybe you could tell us about Atari and ET and Joss Paper.
Yeah, so this is a new series that that I've been working on, and I'm sort of continuing to work on. It came out of a body of work that I developed for a show that I did with another artist, Sunny Asu, who is based in Campbell River right now. And him and I were working on a show called Ready Player 2, which was, we were kind of mining our childhood and exploring it as a way of critiquing sort of contemporary structures, but also kind of analyzing it and investigating it for how it informed who we are as artists right now. And in the show, I had created a bunch of these sort of watercolor replicas. And originally I was kind of thinking about them as, you know, like when an artist invests time in replicating something or doing a still life painting or something like that, what does that gesture mean? What is it imbuing? What is it doing? And there was part of me that was interested in like the fetishizing of these objects. So originally I'd created like, they were basically like watercolor boxes, but of different shapes and sizes. But one was a remake of a Game Boy, the original Nintendo Game Boy, and then an NES, a Nintendo Entertainment System with the remote controls, and then also the first VCR we had when we were children. And I was thinking about how these objects held a lot of power in my life as a child, as a, you know, entering into playing video games, and then also the access to popular culture through VHS cassettes and all that sort of stuff. So that then, as I was working on that series, and this happens a lot, is like I'll have an idea of, or I'll see an image of what I want to create, and I start creating it, and then the work starts unpacking itself as I'm making it, is that I started seeing these objects also in an interesting space with a tradition called Joss Paper, where it is an object that is to be, it's a Chinese Buddhist practice, where you have paper object that you would burn in honor of an ancestor to release. It was the idea is that you're gifting. So they have like fake banknotes, and so you would burn this money, and it would go to Nana up in heaven, kind of loosely speaking, as a gift. And so I really liked that idea, and so that's where this work sort of jumped into, where I definitely was intending to make that reference to this practice. And so there is that idea of the jost paper. And then the other idea I was thinking about was a very contemporary practice of sort of investigating and dealing with one's own sort of experiences and trauma. And there's a sort of a therapeutic practice of writing out something that you've gone through that might have been troubling or private that you kind of are trying to release. And so you'd write it down, and then you would burn it afterwards as a form of release. And some people do this at New Year's. They'll write down things that were weighing them down heavily that year before, and then, which is going to be a really long list this year, and then you burn it, and then it like releases into the ether, and it kind of releases out of yourself. And so there's these kinds of ideas that I'm kind of playing with. And so here I've got the Atari toy or cartridge, and then I have below it a match that is made out of porcelain. And there's two things that are here. Like I'm kind of thinking about my childhood and nostalgia, and kind of loosely thinking about that outsider narrative also kind of within myself that I embodied as a child. And then I'm thinking about this object as that I would burn it not like as a gift to my inner child, like my past self. And also being a middle-aged man, thinking about, you know, trying to dodge the title of man-child, and is a way of saying, oh, I can release these ideas. I don't need to be playing these games or looking at these things nostalgically. I can burn them with this match, but of course it's a porcelain match. That doesn't work. It's almost like saber rattling. I'm just like saying, oh yeah, no, I can let it go, but I'm secretly not letting it go.
Right, right. Like I could quit smoking at any time.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, there is something very sort of tender, I feel like, about this work and about this series, that it has a kind of gentleness and irregularity, I think, that the Manga Ormolu series doesn't. And the Manga Ormolu is very, we didn't really speak to this specifically, but it's very slick in a way. It's very like superbly executed and crafted. Like it's really beautiful. It's really kind of spot on, especially when you see them in person. They're very glamorous in some sense. And this work is much, I think in part because of the scale, but also because of the sense of touch that I think we can see in the painting. It has a sort of gentleness and a tenderness. So I'm curious, like how maybe this is too personal, but I'm wondering if you feel that sense of gentleness or tenderness toward your former self.
That last bit, but I was just like, yes, there is a gentleness towards myself. I think that's always kind of a work in process, like that gentleness towards myself. And I think maybe that is part of this work as well. I haven't really thought about that. I think, and I don't, I want to blame my art training on this, but I think one of my, like anybody that has gone to art school, one of the things is that you become incredibly self-critical about the work that you do and stuff like that. And so to be gentle on oneself is kind of an interesting notion that I don't know if many of my peers do practice, but anyhow, I think there is definitely with this work, I do feel like there's an intimacy with this work. And I did later on in the series, I started making replicas of objects that were really, really kind of close to my heartstrings. There was one that I made of a VHS replica of a movie that we used to watch as kids called They Call Me Bruce. And it is a movie that is about, it is a Korean comedian, and the movie is about him being in America and all of the Americans around him thinking that he's Bruce Lee. And so, but he is kind of this slapstick kind of humor, like he'll trip and people will be like, whoa, 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 don't beat me up, man. And, and it's just like this really ridiculous sort of yeah, playing off of archetypes of what people understand of what it is to be an Asian male. And as children, we thought it was hilarious. And my dad thought it was hilarious. But of course, if we were to view it now, it's just like, there's a lot of problems with this movie in terms of representation. And so, you know, creating an object like that and then wanting to burn it, but also not wanting to burn it, it's interesting. Like, I feel like with me, I find that these objects are a lot more intimate in terms of my own feelings about things and thinking about what it is that I want to burn and what I want to let go, but also what I want to gift myself is in a ways. There's this strange duality about it. And yeah, it's like there's a lot of triggering that goes on with the choice of these objects.
That's super interesting. It's so much, it's in a way you're kind of bringing together the idea of nostalgia and critique in the same mode. There's sort of coming, and maybe there's space for them to exist, kind of connected to each other in this funny way. We do have a handful of questions that I'm very keen to get to, but there's one thing that I've been wanting to ask you about for ages that I want to come back to, and that has to do with more in this series with the idea of drag and camp, actually. And I'm wondering if you think about sort of gender, drag, camp with these in an active way, because they are, especially this one somehow, they are so sort of glamorous, I said before, and this has this kind of, you know, boom flair to it. And there's, you know, there's some tenderness there too, I think, within the kind of slickness also. So I'm curious if you think of these as being connected to drag or camp or a kind of over performance in some way.
Definitely over performance. I am this is so funny. It's like I'm a huge RuPaul's Drag Race fan, and I do like I embrace that sort of more is more aesthetic of making and even doing like it's like the when I make something or when I'm researching something, I kind of end up sort of doing a deep dive or taking it too far and then kind of clawing it back. And so yeah, I think there is that sort of sense of more is more, and I like that sort of maximalist way of working, and I do feel like that. I like that a lot, and I like that sort of sense of sort of opening up the kiln to Christmas morning kind of feel, and that is which is kind of a lot of the same sort of feeling you get when you get a good wig reveal at a drag show. So, like,
so this is sort of the wig reveal that we're looking at.
This is what the wig reveal.
Okay, that's fabulous. Cool.
So yeah, I do feel like that's part of it.
Nice, thank you for that. So I'll go to a couple of questions now. We'll try to go through them a little bit quickly. So you have touched on this a bit around your technique, but I'm wondering you could take this piece maybe as the example. We've had a question about the physical process of creation, and if you could kind of quickly go through sort of layers or steps about sort of what's on where, because I think even for ceramic folks, it can be a little like, oh, like how did that get there?
So in this particular piece, so you have sort of the yellow part. So that is sort of more like a basic cylinder that I'm sort of throwing. And then the upper part is the Mei Ping form. So I will throw a Mei Ping form and then sort of assemble those together. Then sort of the gray elements, those are going to be slab built along with the black one. And then you can't see it in this image, but there is sort of like a boot sort of front toe bit to that, where that is also sort of slab built. So slab building is like where you just take the clay and you roll it out with a rolling pin, and the Mei Ping form and the cylinder form is done on a potter's wheel. And then, so I assemble all these sorts of things, and then I sort of take the form and I sort of am rotating it, and then I draw on top of it where I want those wrinkles to be and how I want that to go. And so, and then the wrinkles are just, they're added through coils or like that big juicy wrinkle on there with the, I think it's a peony's sort of form on there, that I'll just sort of mash out a sort of a flat piece of clay and then bend it and then attach it onto there. And then I start modeling it. And a lot of the techniques I'm using for the modeling of the fleshy forms are techniques that I've just sort of watched YouTube videos of people making monster masks for special effects and that sort of thing. and kind of creating those wrinkles. And it's kind of fun because it's using, I feel like it's using that part of my brain that I use when I'm drawing, when I'm trying to create an illusion, when I'm drawing or rendering wrinkles or, you know, whatever in sort of illusionary space.
That's so cool. I love that you're using like special effects, special effects as part of like a ceramics thing. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Here's another question. Do you have a vision of where you're evolving typically in a piece, or is the transformation more ad hoc?
So when I'm working on a piece, because the work takes me forever, so like a piece like this will probably take me about to get it in or to start in the studio and then get it out to being able to show it, it takes me about 2 months to kind of complete something. Of course, that's also including the time that I'm just leaving it alone and letting it dry very slowly. But what I'll do is I'll often do a full size, or I'll do a lot of sketching, and then I'll do a full scale sketch on a large piece of paper, and that I can use to take measurements from when I'm working on the potter's wheel or when I'm rolling out slabs. And then I sort of do the full construction. When it comes to the sort of the fleshy bits, that's where I kind of leave room for a lot of improvisation, because drawing it out would just be a little too, it'll be like, I don't know, I think it doesn't give me any room to kind of freestyle or improvise while I'm working,
Yeah.
which I enjoy as well. But I would say, to sort of answer the question, I would say that I plan them out probably about 60% and then give myself about 40% to kind of play around with.
Cool, thanks. We have another question about materials, and this has to
Sure.
do with when you work not in ceramic, but in other materials.
Yep.
And the question is, like, kind of how do you choose them? And is it a back and forth where the materials inform the ideas, or do you come into it kind of thinking about the idea and then figure out the material? Kind of how does that balance work for you?
Yeah, I feel like with the material choices, I feel, especially with the working with the Manga Ormlu series, it has so much of the material does inform the content and the ideas behind it, that I feel that I choose materials that have or can add to the conversation as well. Like I feel like with the watercolor objects, like there is the fragility of paper, there is the history of the tradition of just paper objects, these paper replicas, that is part of. And I also like the sort of non-pretentious quality of watercolor painting. Like it is, you know, and in a lot of the similarities to ceramics, there is a large hobby community that that enter into working in clay, that also work in watercolors. It's not, I kind of, I guess maybe I'm a little suspicious of really highbrow materials, like, I don't know, porcelain or oil painting, or I guess video would be the new highbrow. I don't know.
Right, well, sort of traditional hierarchies in a sense,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, one last question, which
Yeah.
has to do with the hybridity topic again, and thinking about Caribbean culture and sort of that as being kind of one of the origin points in of your family, certainly. And the question is around hybridity within Caribbean culture, and asking like how it's sort of so complex and multi-layered within itself. Like, how do you think about the Caribbean as itself a hybrid entity that kind of informs your own self and your work?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because I do
Yeah,
feel
it is.
I do feel like it is an undercurrent that is kind of like, you know, like fish don't know about the water they're swimming in, but when you take them out of there, you're just
Yeah.
like, oh my God, there's water. I need water to live. And I feel like, you know, like my parents are Caribbean, and they definitely have that experience. And I think what is interesting about them is that when we immigrated from, like, even in Ireland, but even, you know, when we immigrated to Canada, when we were looking for communities that my parents would want to hang out with, they would, other than the sort of dominant community, they would hang out with other Trinis, the other Trinidadians. And that was kind of an interesting thing, kind of thinking of, it's like, why, while looking at other, you know, people in my community that were Chinese, they would be like hanging out exclusively with Chinese community. They would not be, they wouldn't be looking for other diasporic people. And so I think there is probably, the way my attraction to the hybrid object, to packing a lot of different ideas and disparate ideas into one object, is probably, yeah, like, now that I think about it, there is something about that Caribbean lifestyle. Like, there's so much going on. Like, food courts in Trinidad are incredible. Like, they have the KFC, but beyond that, they have like Creole food, they have Indian food, they have like all sorts of amazing food. They have Chinese food, but it's just like so incredible, and it's just such a mashup that I think, that probably does feed into where I'm coming from as well, because that, my parents raised me.
Yeah.
So,
For better or worse, here we are. Yeah.
yeah.
I think that's a great place to end. Thank you so much. Brendan, it's been a real treat to speak with you today and to think more about your work and to spend some time talking to you. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Yeah, really appreciate it. And for everyone else, thank you for joining too. It's great that you're all here. For those of you in Toronto, the Gardiner Museum is open. It's open, let's see, Tuesday through Sunday, different hours every day. You can check our website and you can see Brendan's work on view in our Modern and Contemporary Gallery. So thanks again for joining. Please come again for another 3 works. Stay tuned for the next one. Okay, thanks all.
Bye.
Goodbye.